me now in welcoming Chris Marr.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, for the last 4 years, I've been an Olympian, so this weather's a little rough on me. So thanks for having me here. I appreciate the turnout. I know there's a range of interests that are represented, some purely academic, some recreational, some a mixture of both. So what I'd like to do is spend about 30, 40 minutes kind of giving an overview, some background on Initiative 502 and the recreational marijuana system it's set up, and I'll talk about a number of challenges along with what we've observed in Colorado with their recent rollout. I may zip through a few of these slides relatively quickly because some of it's somewhat granular, but I have to tell you, when we do presentations, I'm kind of surprised at the amount of fact-free analysis that comes with a lot of comments and questions. So I think it's important to at least have a little bit of an overview. A lot of you have noticed the allusion in the title to the Grateful Dead, and I'll say that's there. But also, I think it's a reference to marijuana's kind of strange transformation in terms of public perception and social acceptance, in particular over the last couple decades. It also refers to the fact that when I was watching a Grateful Dead concert at Winterland 40-something years ago, I never thought I'd be doing this. So, this next slide is basically saying nothing's final till the board makes a decision. These are my opinions. Please don't sue us or sue me, because believe me, after liquor privatization, we'll still have a lot of lawsuits to go through. So if you're going to invest in the business, go in with your eyes open and don't believe what I say. Just want to talk for a second about the Liquor Board. Obviously, our mission going into this was the fair administration of liquor laws through education, voluntary compliance, responsible sales, and so on. That now applies to the cannabis space as well. The LCB, when we say the Liquor Control Board, and there's legislation right now to change us to the Liquor and Cannabis Board, saves on letterhead since we're still the LCB, is right now downsized. Used to be close to 1,400, about 260 employees, covering regulatory, licensing, enforcement, revenue collection, education, all those functions. But there's also a board, which are 3 members, which are appointed by the governor. Was appointed by Governor Gregoire and confirmed by the Senate. So there's the agency and there's the board, of which I'm one of 3 members. So why is the LCB involved in marijuana regulation? Well, and this answer will come up a lot, because the initiative told us to do it. That's the gist of it. But I think the reason the initiative did that, as the ACLU and others were framing it, is there was a high degree of public confidence in our ability to control the public safety and youth access piece of it. And that was a big selling point as far as the initiative. And also our experience in a 3-tier alcohol system. And also we had some capacity after we finished the shutdown of the liquor system. Let me talk for a second about direct democracy, or government by initiative, as it applies to Initiative 502. The key message, if you remember the moms that did the commercials, was marijuana is going to be safe. I don't use it, but marijuana is going to be safer by regulating it. And by the way, there'll be more money for schools and all those things. There was not a direct message, quite frankly, to users. Why? Because there's different data out there, but regular users account for about 6% of the population. So you weren't going to get very far with that. I think people that had ever tried it, the polling indicates about 38%. So when I hear arguments from folks that say, well, they did this because people realized ganja was put on the earth by God and we should all have a right to it, I say, well, I don't think that's the argument that most people bought into when they voted for it, but maybe some folks. Also, there was very little opposition, except the medical marijuana industry, or certain parts of it, as you probably know. It was endorsed by major dailies, NORML, NAACP, even Pat Robertson endorsed it. It was, and this is what I point out to people, you talk about Initiative 1183, liquor privatization being lopsided. The opponents were outspent 400 to 1, and the actual numbers are 6.2 million to 16,000. Okay, so you had a pretty, a lot of things going for it. It did pass by a 56 to 44% vote. What I find really interesting is that 18 to 21-year-old participation, which normally runs about 10%, was 21%. So it was obviously an issue that motivated a lot of younger people. So as many of you who have observed the process understand, there are advantages and disadvantages to direct democracy. It does move politically thorny, risky issues along much more quickly, as we know in this state from marriage equality, and certainly in the past around minimum wage and others. And it supposedly takes out the Olympia special interests. The disadvantage is it introduces a whole new set of special interests, that is, people who write checks, if you want to say that. It does lack some transparency, unlike a legislative process, which arguably does have more. It does often creates a lack of consistency with current laws and regulations. It glosses over them and says, well, we'll figure that out in the rulemaking process, or the legislature can fix that later if there's some inconsistencies, because I'm sure, as most of you are aware, it did create a number of conflicts with the medical marijuana space and some other areas of law. So the bottom line is it was written to be saleable to the voters, not necessarily to create good public policy. We did, by voting for this, create the world's first comprehensive system of growing, processing, and retailing marijuana, along with Colorado, which passed a constitutional amendment at the same time. Uruguay, by the way, is the first nation that joined us shortly, a little while ago. They actually came to a meeting with Colorado and Washington a number of months before that, indicating that was their plan. It's tolerated in places like the Netherlands. It's not, we actually don't have a fully legalized system there. So what did 502 do? Well, first of all, a month after the initiative passed, it made possessing an ounce of usable, an ounce legal for adults 21 and older, decriminalized it in various forms. It also directed a 3-tier system of licensing, regulation, and taxation. Now, a lot of us don't really know why there needs to be a 3-tier system. In fact, what it did is it created these tiers around producers, processors, and retailers. It probably would have been good to create a distribution tier instead of a processor tier, but that's how it was written, so that's what we're working with. It's a pretty ambitious tax scheme. It imposes a 25% excise tax at each of those tiers. We've tried to find ways of interpreting it so only 2 of those tiers apply. That is, so the processor tier does not have to pay in many cases if I hold a producer-processor license. B&O and local taxes apply. The fiscal note, when this first was proposed as a ballot measure, OFM said between $0 and $2 billion over 5 years. Now, it's interesting because the latest Revenue Forecast Council numbers, by my calculation, actually come in around over $1 billion, about 1.3 for a 5-year period. But again, I think everyone's kind of spitballing there. It did establish a THC bloodstream threshold for marijuana DUIs, limited store locations, earmarked some of that money. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Some of it went for healthcare, research, and education. I think actually WSU does get some money for that. Timing, we had to have all the rules in place by December 1st. So it's important to understand the difference between laws and rules. Laws, obviously, enacted by the legislature or by initiative. Rules are basically, I guess you could say, the fine print that helps implement that helps define the intent of the initiative. In some cases, those can be challenged. You're probably, if you remember around liquor privatization, we interpreted 24 liters of liquor to mean you can buy 24 liters a day. Costco came in and said, no, you could line up shopping carts one behind the other as long as it was a separate piece of paper. You could buy, if you're a restaurant, 24 liters till the cows come home. And the court says, yeah, technically that's what it is. So sometimes it isn't always easy to understand. We did go through a process. We asked for external consultant teams because we understood we did not know a lot about marijuana itself. So we had a number, I forget how many, 56 proposals, team proposals. I think the publisher of High Times was part of one of the proposing groups. We ended up contracting with a company called Botech. Dr. Mark Kleiman out of UCLA actually has quite a background, but there were many sub-consultants with specific area knowledge. A number of these people are already operating in the medical marijuana space. One gentleman was involved with a large-scale Dutch grower that grows for the Dutch government. We did this a lot differently than we normally do with rulemaking. We did 14 public forums and statewide meetings. We decided before we even enter a rulemaking process, which are normally very technical, arcane processes, we're going to go out and just hear what people have to say. And we did that. Thousands of people testified, and it was an interesting process. We also, on an ongoing basis, had regular conference calls with Colorado, because their system, remember, they passed the constitutional amendment the same day we did, but their system was up and running on January 1st, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's our timeline. It's been a busy 15 months, but we believe that we're coming down to the point of issuing producer licenses. In fact, we have some folks, could be as soon as the next week or two, that our first producer licenses will be issued. You'll hear something about that. And then we see the lottery for retail licenses being maybe in April, first stores in June. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. The initiative basically calls for us to create a 3-month residency requirement. The initiative was pretty clear, and I think that was a selling point. Well, we're not going to let outside interests come in here and run our system. So you have to be a resident of the state. You have to prove residency for 3 months. That includes all of your financiers. Proven to be a little challenge for some folks. We do background checks, and we apply a point system. You have to disclose all arrests. Here's the interesting thing we went through, because obviously a lot of people that are involved with this space have had disagreements with the law, let's just say, in the past. A number of them have significant records. We could have made the decision really to have drawn the line in terms of those arrests. What we decided to do is to understand the nature of the background-sized individuals. So we actually provide an exception for 2 misdemeanor convictions for possession within 3 years, and as long as you disclose it, if your felony is more than 10 years ago, then we will allow you to go ahead and apply for a license. We originally allowed people to apply for up to 3 licenses, and I'll tell you why that is. I'm the one that raised the concern internally around retail licenses, because there's going to be a finite number, 384, I think, something like that. The concern is about market concentration, because there's going to be a lottery initially, but there's nothing to prevent, McWeed to come in here and buy up 150 stores. Then you have the ability to affect pricing and so on. That's kind of let's just say it's a colorable argument you can make, our Attorney General said, but I do feel it was important. So I insisted that we cap the number of licenses basically at 3 for operators. Also, I think there is, certainly amongst the people that testified, and I believe among the public, an underlying sentiment that they want this to be smaller scale and entrepreneurial. At the same time, you have a problem, because in order to compete with the illicit market, we have to have scale. Because, let's face it, 30,000 grows, which is 90,000, will produce at lower cost than a 2,000 square foot grow. So we basically did that going and said, look, you can have up to 3 licenses. Well, we ran into, so anyways, how do we come up with that? Well, RAND gave us a consumption study. It said in the state of Washington in 2008, we consumed 175 metric tons of marijuana. That seems like a lot. But then again, I'm not a regular user. Our share is expected to start at 13% on day 1 and go up to 25% at the end of the first year. You're only getting 25% of the market? That's right. We're not going to displace a well-established illicit market, nor a pretty robust medical marijuana industry out there. It's just not going to happen. And so what we did, the other thing was, if you're going to set up a marketplace, those of you obviously have taken economics, I'm sure most of you have taken 101, you know that it's important to have good signals in the marketplace. We don't have good signals. The initiative said anyone that writes you a check for $250 can apply for a license. We've said it's a relatively low threshold. We'll give you a license. But the original plan, what was originally called for, is just give us your plan and let us know how much you're going to produce. Well, if I'm inexperienced, I'm like 100,000. Put me down for 100,000. We had no good numbers, so we created what's called tiering in order to say, at least tell us what range you're going to be in. Okay, but we did see that there were going to be some issues here. So the problem, right? Instead of 500 applications, we received close to 2,900 applications. They added up to 35 million square feet of canopy. And what did I say? We needed to be closer to 2 million square feet of canopy. Now, why do you want to cap canopy? That's a good question. Because the federal government has been very clear, one of their primary concerns is diversion. They don't want marijuana going out of that system, going across state lines. They feel like their job is to deal with illicit marijuana. They don't want to add to that. So basically, and I won't go into math on that, but we factored in a number of things. We know that initially we're seeing a 26% failure rate on applications coming in. They want to locate it near a school. They don't have their money together. They don't pass basic background checks. We know that the Colorado, we know not everyone's producing to tier maximum. We know that the Colorado experience is 50% of these businesses went out of business within a year. For all those reasons, we were able to bring down the number, and then what we said was we don't have any choice. We can either say the first 200 people in the door get licenses and the rest of you go home. We're cutting back everyone to 10%. If you're planning on producing 30,000, 3,000 is not going to work from a business standpoint. Or we can say, we'll give you your first license, and we're going to cut that back 30%. The other two you can either withdraw or we'll put on hold. Now, quite frankly, I think, my personal opinion is, our estimates of demand are going to go up. Right now, I think we're around 4.9 million square feet of canopy that we'll end up with. But there's no way to know exactly until this thing actually shakes out because we're starting a new market. But I think that number will move up for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, as we speak, as a number of you know, medical marijuana is being considered to be brought into this channel. 1,000-foot buffer, I'll just mention that more, for example, there is a 1,000-foot rule, which says you can't be within 1,000 feet of schools, but also playgrounds, arcades, all these things. The feds actually don't have that long a list, and they don't have a 1,000-foot rule. It's actually an aggravator to drug crimes. But we basically said, well, let's measure it like we do liquor, common path of travel, right? You're not going to go across an 8-lane freeway. It makes sense to us. Certainly helps out Seattle, which has some real problems. Well, after we came out with that, the 2 U.S. attorneys sat down and said, no, that doesn't work for us. My response was, well, it would have been nice to know that a few months back, but thanks for telling us. We couldn't put our licensees in a position to fail, so we actually changed that. So when you hear out the buffer. The initiative called for a very low application fee, as I said, $250,000 renewal fee. Colorado's much higher, by the way. Your fees could go up to as high as $15,000. Your initial application fees could go as high as $5,000, but ours are very low. Licensed applicants must attest they are current with Department of Revenue. There are a lot of people who operate presently in the medical marijuana space that don't pay any taxes at all. And so this is basically saying you better learn how to operate in a regulated environment or don't participate. And there's liability insurance. We're going to allow people to grow indoor and outdoor. This was interesting because originally Colorado didn't allow outdoor grows, and we had all this concern from neighborhood groups and law enforcement, don't allow outdoor grows. And we said, what's the difference between a 8-foot high chain link fence with closed circuit surveillance cameras and a steel-sided building? I mean, someone could break into either. So we basically backed off and said, look, that size, it can be outside in chain link fence, or it can be, with all these security precautions. The issue, as some of you know, is indoors you can get as 5 to 6 crop yields a year, or crops a year. Outside 1.7. So the economics are going to come into play there. So, and I don't claim to be an expert, so if some of you think I'm off on the numbers. Local authorities can object based on chronic illegal activity, but in general, there are very limited ways to object. We'll do background checks, assign a point system, I talked about that, a lot of surveillance. Hours of operation are limited to 8 to midnight. It's interesting, the prevention community came back and made that argument that for public safety reasons, we should cut those hours back to noon. In my view, I can't find a stronger argument for marijuana than alcohol, quite frankly, and that's kind of a destination marijuana tourism site. Why apply it to marijuana? But we did agree on that compromise. As I said, advertising very much restricted within 1,000 feet of schools. You can't make misleading statements, or you can't appeal to kids. Many people want us to go further, but we have to remind them that there is a First Amendment, and so you can advertise. We will limit the number of retail outlets to 334 statewide, and that was based on analysis of consumption and rolled out based on population. For example, King County, I believe, has about 61 allocated retail licenses. 21 of those will be in Seattle. And then 4 other of the largest cities also have specific allocations. Some are at large. Spokane has 18, 8 of them in Spokane, and Whitman has 4, 3 in Pullman. apparently there's more potential in Pullman than other parts of Whitman County. We'll create more license as the market grows. We now have 2,200 applicants for 334 retail licenses. So we're going to have to hold a lottery on that, probably be in April. Strict packaging and label requirements, very different than a medical marijuana dispensary, if you're familiar with there. Although a number of them do some level of disclosure, our packaging and labeling requirements are very different. Very strict rules around lot testing by independent accredited labs, and we don't allow minors in our stores, and signage is controlled. No open containers. We will allow sniff jars, but this, again, is very different than medical marijuana dispensaries, if you're familiar with there. We did define serving sizes, and we did provide some limits on concentrates, although interestingly, and this is one of the hitches you have with an initiative, the initiative actually does not allow extracts in a pure form. Now, again, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently this is an emerging area of the market. A lot of younger users are more partial to extract inhalation. So, but it's not defined as usable marijuana. Only the green part of the plant was. So we basically said, okay, if you put a 1% inert oil in it, it's not an extract. So that's how we're getting around it, although we do have legislation request in there in order to change that, but it just shows you the things you have to do to get around it. So, challenges. There is an existing market for marijuana, as a number of you know. The rough estimates that our consultant was using is about 85% of that is illicit, and 15% is the medical marijuana market. But acknowledging that could be twice as high, so maybe it's 30%. But we know the illicit market's the biggest part of this. And again, we'll get 13% market share on day one, 25% after the first year. The other thing is the initiative did reference the black market as a reason to legalize, but interestingly did not provide any money to local government to fund enforcement actions. Now, that probably was a conscious decision not to alienate certain parts of the electorate who didn't want the man to get some money here. But the fact is that it creates some problems. Why? Because as I've talked to law enforcement around the state, they rightly argue of you can't make a public safety argument anymore. You've just legalized this. This is a revenue argument. And you have to say, yeah, you're right. So what you do, if you want law enforcement to continue to clamp down on the bad guys, and I'm thinking more in terms of large-scale grows and people that sell to kids, but whatever, you have to provide them some incentive. They just got their budgets cut, and they're going to go back to their city council and say, by the way, I'd like to hire 3 more officers to go after the illicit marijuana trade. So the bill that's 5887 that some of you have heard about, the so-called medical marijuana bill, actually provides 15% of marijuana revenues to local governments in order to address that. And we can talk a little bit about that. There is a local preemption issue. A lot of you saw the news around this. Initially, our AG said that there isn't the ability of local government to preempt the state's rights to license and these businesses to be cited. In his wisdom, we asked for a formal opinion. In his wisdom, the Attorney General came back and said, well, I changed my mind. Because it's not specifically called out for, we believe the locals have the right to preempt state law. Now, there was a mixed blessing in this. It actually, I don't know if it precludes, but it does probably lessen the possibility of a lawsuit around federal preemption. If a federal preemption lawsuit were to prevail, everything kind of comes to a crashing halt around medical marijuana and recreational marijuana all around the country. So in any event, Colorado, by the way, does have local preemption. I'll show you a chart in a minute because it's pretty significant. We're not going to have that same problem. Only 2 significant large counties, Clark and Pierce, have indicated they want to go in the direction of bans, and that's just in unincorporated areas. I don't foresee that being as much of a problem. In eastern Washington, could be a problem in certain areas, but in most high population areas, not so much. There will be a challenge around pricing. Right after the market opened in Colorado, prices moved to $40 a gram. But in the end, the laws of economics will prevail, particularly with frequent users. To be honest with you, the infrequent users, there are a number of them that really don't have a dealer friend, are probably going to go to our stores. So We do need to revisit our tax structure, because I'll acknowledge, and some have said, what were they smoking when they wrote the initiative, but it is pretty aggressive, let me put it that way, and it creates challenges. So there are opportunities, obviously enhancing state revenues, and as I said, for the first time, the Revenue Forecast Council started putting numbers out there on marijuana. And if you add up everything, not just the general fund, but across all different fund types, you're easily over $1 billion, maybe 1.2 billion or so. And that's not considering the fact that there might be a merger of a medical marijuana market. The issue on marijuana tourism. Interestingly, we've had some conversations with Seattle. That's the only large city that's been pretty upfront about this. And we have reinforced that it's not appropriate for marijuana and alcohol to be consumed in our licensed facilities, and we're not for that. But if you want to license private clubs, because remember the initiative said you can't smoke in public, we're okay with that. Just, licensed clubs. So I think Seattle will look seriously. They are challenges, but I think we'll work through them. Remember, liquor laws are 80 years old. In my mind, you will soon see a commoditized product, not soon, but in a shorter amount of time than liquor, a commoditized product produced at scale, maybe in fields. That would seem the direction we're going. But the public, in terms of their concerns, we all know aren't there at this point, so we have a pretty regulated marketplace. Colorado, what do we know from that? Well, first of all, don't believe everything you see on TV, because I watch the NBC Nightly News, and I'm thinking this thing's rolling out pretty nicely. Well, here's what you need to know. That system was superimposed on a tightly regulated medical marijuana marketplace. We don't have anything like that, for a variety of reasons, including Governor Gregoire's section vetoing a number of the regulations. And quite frankly, it would have really been tempting to follow their model. But the feds basically said, it's an untenable market, and we're going to shut it down. So we couldn't do that. So we have a ground up. They superimposed on a tightly regulated medical marijuana system. Only existing dispensaries will sell recreational for the first year. Okay, and then in January 1st, 2015, then new recreational stores can come in the market. And these stores are already producing. These stores are vertically integrated, meaning they have a grow area in the back that I think they're required to produce up to 70% of what they sell, and a retail location in the front. That's our initiative specifically does not allow for vertical integration, so we don't have that ability. The other thing we know is, again, despite the video you saw, only 8 recreational marijuana stores were open in Colorado on day 1 when you saw the story on the news. As of today, 33, or the other day, 33 were open. Eventually, 200 something will be open, and so that's a concern. Very different tax structure. Their effective rate is around 29 to 30%. Our effective rate is somewhere between 60 and 85 when you roll the different taxes up. So it's much more of a challenge. They do allow locals to apply a local sales tax option, though. Denver has a 3.5% local sales tax. They're estimating state revenues about $100 million a year. Right now, the estimate for Washington is about 160. They have higher license fees, as I indicated earlier. And they do allow personal cultivation for recreational users. Our initiative did not allow for that. So here's the chart I was pointing out. Counties could opt out, and cities, before January 1st. Many did. Of the top 10 cities, population-wise, in Colorado, 4 have bans and 5 have moratoriums. Only 1 allows for recreational marijuana sales, as of now. So the Colorado system is to be looked at, but there are challenges. We think we're going to have much better availability in Washington after the rollout. There are ways to stay connected. If you go to liq.wa.gov, we have a separate click-through that has all the research we talked about, FAQs, all that stuff, a lot of video, and if you want to know more, you can look at that. Here's where we are. We're processing applications, as I said. We started back in November. As I said, we should issue them, and that actually requires to walk into your facility to look at where you're going to grow and signing off on it. This is interesting, too. I should probably point out, how does marijuana become legal, right? Everything's illegal. The seed is illegal. How do you guys create legal marijuana? It was a conundrum we faced. So basically what we said is, oh, I want to talk about the traceability system, too. Basically, we have a system that requires you to enter everything in. So when the plant is registered, it goes in with a barcode in a software system that we can access, and it tells us how much the plant weighs and how big it is and everything. As you remove each piece of foliage off that, you must record that in the traceability system. Now, this is being used across the country in medical marijuana systems, so we know it works. So we actually have analysts that can detect whether or not there's leakage, and some of that product is not going where, because we know what the yield should be at the end. Okay, but I was talking about the problem was, so there's no such thing as legal marijuana. What do? Well, what we decided to do is on the day you, the processor, the producer, get your license, you have 15 days to bring plants or seeds into your system. We really don't want to know where they came from. We just want them to be registered in the system. Okay, once that closes, that becomes the stock that's available. There really was no way around it. We couldn't say, go to this legal source and get your plants, right? So most of them, consequently, are going to be starting from clones, large mother plants, and not from seeds, which means they'll come to the market quicker. So, anyways, first retail stores open in June or July, but it won't be in huge numbers. So, with that, hope I didn't rush through, but that probably will evoke some questions from you folks. So, I'm happy to answer them or confuse you folks further. Yeah.
You addressed further the moratoriums in eastern Washington counties that are really impacting a lot of counties that.
Right. Well, first of all, I took some issue with the Attorney General opinion. Quite frankly, I think it's pretty clear that there is an ability to locally preempt. However, keep in mind that it is a case-by-case basis. I believe that in some cases, local jurisdictions need more time to evaluate where am I going to cite this, their neighborhood issues, agricultural issues, and all that. There are some jurisdictions that have basically said, and at a hearing, I asked Joyce Mulliken, used to be a state senator, your constituents voted for this 53 to 47. Are you going to tell them that they shouldn't have access to it? And she said, Mr. Marr, that's the federal law. Well, it's kind of interesting hearing her advocate for federal supremacy, but in any event, but there are some jurisdictions that said no way, no how, we'll never allow it. I think that will have to be resolved through a few lawsuits, and but I don't think it's going to be as big a problem as we think. You are right in that in more rural areas where you don't have the options of, obviously Vancouver is going to sell it, right? So even if Clark County doesn't allow zoning, they will. So it's an issue. To be honest with you, I think once they see the revenue possibilities, it is interesting, and I'll make this observation. I had a Democratic legislator, and I talked about the long strange trip, right, how the politics, it was once emblematic of the counterculture. She was saying, well, I think we should be able to get Republican votes for this, and because, and I said, don't think of this as marijuana users or advocates or growers being of one political persuasion. I think I've run into more Tea Partiers and libertarians around marijuana than I have people that want to hug Barack Obama. So it is an interesting group, but I think at the end of the day, I think there will be some acceptance, if for no other reason than I think local government wants the money. So, yeah.
From a law enforcement standpoint, how do you feel that this will affect the illicit markets brought on by Mexican drug cartels and things like that across the border, and then also the flood out of, or the possible flood out of Washington into Oregon, Idaho, Canada, and things like that, because it could potentially.
Well, that's been an interesting discussion. Mike Ormsby is the U.S. attorney here, and I have had discussions. In fact, I have lunch with him, and I'll have lunch with him tomorrow. I think the DEA, I think they'll continue to do interdiction and make efforts to keep the cartel market. But I think actually British Columbia is more of an issue here. Yeah. Keep those under control. And I think you'll still see large-scale raids and things of that nature. As far as diversion across state lines, listen, Colorado originally was going to go with a requirement that you had to have a Colorado license. Now you can buy a quarter of an ounce instead of an ounce, which a state resident can. I think that's only to keep the lines down. I don't think that's to keep them going there. We anticipate that, yeah, there will be a lot of interest of folks coming across the border to buy an ounce. I know Idaho's done a lot of posturing about cracking down on people at the border. I mean, that's certainly their right. But yeah, I do think, and quite frankly, I think it's interesting. They checked the number of Google searches for Washington and Colorado right after this was passed, and I think, how many of you ever landed in Amsterdam and wondered about, you know, the hash houses, the coffee houses. I mean, I think marijuana tourism is going to be a reality. What we have to do, though, at the end of the day, is we need to comply with the Cole Memorandum. And that says we need to make every attempt to control diversion. I'm not so concerned about a guy buying an ounce who's from Idaho, or somehow buying 2 ounces or 3 ounces because they go to 3 stores and coming back selling to his buddy. What we're concerned about is one of our growers feeling the financial temptation to sell it into the black market. And we have to show that we're prepared to respond to that. So we're going to be working pretty closely with law enforcement. I think law enforcement's coming around now. I think there was at first a lot of concern about funding and things like that. But it'll be a challenge. I mean, I will tell you, this is, at some level, this is about revenue. It's not about public safety. But it also is about public safety when you're talking about large crime syndicates, which don't stop at marijuana, obviously. They have a portfolio. So, yeah.
Something that's kind of interesting in respect to the DUI is why, with alcohol, why it's under the influence because of how it impairs your behavior while you're driving versus the effects that marijuana has on you. They're simply not the same. They're not really comparable. So why is it just continually thrown in the same category when it doesn't do the same thing?
That's, you know, the impairment issue is not something specifically under the bailiwick of the Liquor Board, but I have been present when a lot of these discussions have happened. And there is a lot of argument on the 5 nanogram per se limit, as many of you know. Some people are arguing that 5 nanograms isn't enough to define what causes impairment. There are other people, particularly in the medical marijuana community, that says my body retains a base level which may exceed 5 nanograms, and you can apply that same standard. The argument that's often offered back is you still have to prove impairment. You still have to do something, like pull a UE in the middle of the road, to be pulled over. So that's one argument, although I understand the purely legal argument in terms of, so, I mean, that's part of the problem of not having adequate research, in my view, around something like this that's going to be so pervasive and so widely used. One thing I didn't mention around opportunities is I think research, particularly for universities, especially Washington State, obviously, whose, you know, agriculture is in your wheelhouse, certainly the life sciences, those things. I know that there's some work being done right now on a kind of a non-invasive kind of breathalyzer type test, which is something we need. By the way, that's a real problem because right now you need to take a swab or a blood test in order to detect THC levels in your body, and if you ask anyone from the ACLU, they'll tell you that that probably ain't going to fly. So can we afford to have 20 people lined up for blood tests? No. So that will be a challenge, but I will grant you that's something the legislature is grappling with now. What's the limit and how can you justify? At the end of the day, I think the issue is going to be impairment, but I admit that's not something I'm totally knowledgeable about. Yeah, in the back.
Right now, like with the NCAA, marijuana is illegal for athletes to use and things like that. With like the legalization of marijuana, like in the states and things like that, how is it going to affect? Because you know, athletes, like kids, look up to athletes, and as they become more known that this athlete does this or does that, and marijuana, does it affect you as you grow and like with brain development and with more kids like get involved with that and maybe not be as successful as they could have been? Is that?
Well, I mean, right? I mean, that went amongst us older people like Nick Leverich and I. We thought about that as we voted for it. Listen, I grew up on the Monterey Peninsula, right during the '60s. I went to the Monterey Pop Festival. I went down to Big Sur every weekend. So I'm not going to suggest that I'm not familiar with drug usage among younger people, okay, on an intimate basis. And as a parent, when this initiative came up, I thought, geez, there were enough distractions. I have enough friends that were lost to the drug culture, right? Do kids nowadays need more distractions? But at the end of the day, it's there already. So you might as well deal with it in a way that's more regulated. But then I go back to that whole issue of we really have to have more research around this. You know, whether you're talking about medical marijuana or the effects on kids' brain development, the problem with scheduling the drug and this kind of aversion of marijuana bad has kept us from having real science that we can base public policy decisions on. And that, to me, that's wrong. But I agree with you, and that's the big struggle. And, you know, is 21 the right age to say people shouldn't be able to access marijuana? I mean, I really don't know. I mean, we know it's probably not good for a 4-year-old. At what point does it become okay? I really don't know, but that's a struggle. Yeah.
So what sort of threat does the federal government pose towards like federal universities that are federally funded? Like what kind of threat are they posing against us starting research here?
Well, there's certainly an aversion amongst universities to be involved. I can tell you that was the message there. But, you know, this fear of the boogeyman of the feds coming in and kicking down the door and taking away your money, I know is often raised by folks as an objection. Do I think that's going to happen under this president, or even if Mitt Romney is president? I don't think so. But you're right. I mean, there is a fiduciary responsibility on the part of people that run institutions like this to not make decisions that put that at risk.
So is there going to be any protection from the state should the federal government strip funding because of it? Would the state be willing to do anything in their
Well, you know, the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, has said he would be willing, he'll be willing to fight the actions by the federal government. You know, do I think it's going to happen? Yeah. Could it technically happen? Sure. I mean, they could come in tomorrow and decide the Cole Memorandum wasn't worth the paper it was written on, and we're shutting this down. Yeah, is that going to happen? I'm skeptical.
Does the state of Washington have any guidance for businesses that are going to engage in marijuana sales regarding the deduction of business expenses
Okay,
on their federal tax return?
I didn't cover this, but let's talk this about the financials. The banking issue has been larger, but I'll come back to your issue. So, you know, we resolved through the Cole Memorandum issues around the federal government preemption, or the threat of preemption. But we still ultimately have the issue of marijuana today is a cash-based business. Yeah, there are medical marijuana businesses being banked, but their relationship with their banks usually is like, well, I don't really want to know about that. I mean, no matter what they tell you, that's what happens, right? The problem with recreational marijuana, the first issue that was raised was us by the state. Are you going to take our tax money? And the bottom line was the Bank of America, which has the state contract and is due to be renewed for 7 years, said, I will take the money. You know, billions of dollars. And then the other big banks started coming in, but they made the justification, oh, that's tax revenues. We feel we're comfortable there. The problem is you need to bank a system of commerce. See, if you're a grower, you need access to a bank more than I do as the state. Someone's going to take my money. You need loans. You need all those things that facilitate commerce. So that's why you had this discussion of saying, and keep in mind that the DOJ doesn't, this isn't like Barack Obama making a statement and then talking to Eric Holder and say we have to make this work. The Fed, for good reasons, is insulated from political pressure. But when they went back, and I'll give Denny Heck a lot of credit on the other side of the state, he's a legislator from Olympia area, he got this. Really, we had to plan for a couple possibilities because we didn't know that the guidance that came out on the 14th to banks saying, if you do your reporting like this, we will accept it. That is, you have to identify it as coming from recreational marijuana sources. Then you can file a different type of form or what have you. Had that not come out, we still are prepared. In fact, there's $1.6 million in the budget to allow money to be taken in large quantities at DOR offices in Spokane and Seattle, and also our offices. Counting rooms, the whole thing, because we think a lot of folks are still going to act who are, let's just say, skeptical of the system, are going to choose to operate that way. We're not getting good answers now about banking these businesses in general. There's a bank that I can't name that looks like they will step up. It's a bank that's not far from here in terms of where it's located, a credit union, but a lot of the big national banks are being coy. A lot of people think it's because they actually want changes in other parts of the federal. This is how big companies work, right? We'll give you what you want, but we want all this other relief in all these other areas that don't have anything to do with it. At the end of the day, it will happen. The unfortunate thing is, if you are a producer putting up a facility now, you need access to a loan. Now, if you're a Microsoft millionaire, you already have the money. That's what's unfortunate about not having that in place. I do believe when our stores open, we will have the ability for credit card and non-cash transactions and all that to happen at the retail stores. The problem is you won't really have a smoothly functioning system of commerce. Now, to get back to your point, you know, we talk about the tax structure that we're imposing in the state as being an inhibitor. Well, what if you, as a business, you couldn't deduct anything as an expense, and that's your point, is that everything is treated as profit. Well, and that's, to be honest with you, that's the problem medical marijuana faces today, but medical marijuana in general doesn't report income. So that's kind of the next piece that has to be addressed. And I know a lot of people are getting a lot of different advice from different accountants and attorneys, but it's a big risk factor. So I don't have a good answer for you there, but deductibility of expenses is a major issue. Yeah.
From a policy change perspective, this issue is really interesting because we know that one of the main things that drives policy change is the change in how we view a policy, the policy image. Can you speculate on what's happened in the last 20 years or 15 years to make the image of marijuana change fairly dramatically?
I think there's general acceptance that the war on drugs hasn't generated. I mean, we spent a lot of money on it. We succeeded in disproportionately incarcerating a lot of people of color, low-income people. It hasn't necessarily improved the living of people in third world countries, which generally tend to provide a lot of these drugs that we use. I think it's the reality of, whether or not you accept the fact that it's good to have people consuming this stuff. A lot of people have different opinions about the death penalty, right? But they're coming to the reality, whether it be driven by economics or other reasons, to say, well, it isn't working. So I think it's that. This idea, and I think along with that is this idea of somehow it's government's role to protect us from things. Although I will tell you, people will say, well, you're set up a regulatory system that's designed to protect us from something that I don't think is harmful. Yeah, that's true. I don't think we're that comfortable. But I think that's why I think we will more and more morph to a commoditized system where it'll be available at the grocery store and, for good or bad. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, but it is fascinating to see how societal views have kind of morphed on that. And I'm talking about in short order, right? Not time is very short in terms of changes nowadays compared to when Nick and I were kids. Yeah.
So in the past, the smell of cannabis was probable cause for them to search every square inch of Yoka. And now that it's legal, if I pull over and my car smells like a Chief John concert, can they in Washington, can they search my car?
I'm not in law enforcement, but I will tell you, an ounce of marijuana is probably going to create an odor, and you can legally possess an ounce of marijuana. So it seems to me it would be difficult, unless they had probable cause to believe your trunk was full of bricks of marijuana, how they would prove that, but I'm not really familiar with that. I do want to touch one thing, and I'm surprised, and I didn't make a note to talk about it because I'm inundated with this, and that's the whole medical marijuana issue. So let me just take a couple minutes to address that. I don't know if any of you are kind of familiar with that. I voted twice for medical marijuana bills when I was in the state Senate, and didn't pay a lot of attention to it after that, to be honest with you, because I'm not a consumer, or regular consumer, I put it that way. And I was quite frankly shocked that there were so many gray-haired guys with ponytails that were business people in that sector. So it's a real conundrum out there. You have a segment of the market that are people that are really about compassionate care, access, for folks at little to no cost. And then, to be honest with you, you have a group of people that are protecting their financial interests, and I totally get that. So they felt very much under siege in the legalization process, as I mentioned. They were the biggest opponents of Initiative 502. And but what has emerged since then is the understanding of it's very difficult to have a marketplace that operates over here, because at the end of the day, marijuana is a weed, okay? It doesn't cost a lot to produce. What drives costs are taxes in our case, but the risk of being incarcerated and losing all your assets. So, the illicit market certainly, but I'm talking about medical marijuana, was at some point going to be considered to be folded in the system. People saying, well, why can't it be served by your market? So we actually had a budget proviso last year that directed us LCB, DOR, and DOH to go back and come up with recommendations on how to harmonize the market. Well, we came back and we did suggest merging the two markets, which is going to require by the end of 2015 that dispensaries, as you know them, will go away. And it does allow for personal grows for people who have authorizations, tightens up the authorization process, because I think most of us will acknowledge that's familiar with the system. It is very loose in this state, and creates a registry and a number of other things. Now, it's interesting because I watched, we provide the recommendations, and the legislature does stuff in its own wisdom. But it's interesting because that is a very disparate group, the medical marijuana industry. I liken them to a circular firing squad. Between themselves, they have a lot of arguments, and it is very difficult to get any type of consensus. I think a number of them came in very stridently advocating the legislature. The bottom line is, a bill, I believe, has a good chance of passing. And it might be 5887, which is Senator Rivers' bill, which reflects the recommendations that were made there. And so I think it's very possible you're going to see a merger of the system. At the end of the day, though, we have to ask ourselves, and again, lack of science, right? Because we're hearing a lot of assertions that there are certain strains, high CBD, low THC, will not be available in the new marketplace. Well, that's a problem, because just anecdotal evidence indicates it's not good not to allow people access to that needs it. So I think the law will allow you to produce more on your own if you need them for those strains in order to have adequate supply. But we're going to have to monitor that. And we're looking at doing, if the system comes to be, looking at medical marijuana endorsements or standalone medicals. The problem is there's a lack of science. So as DOH, how do you say that's a practice I will endorse at dispensaries because it's not accepted within medicine that marijuana is, in fact, a drug or a suitable treatment for certain things. That's the whole conundrum that we're around here. At the end of the day, though, that'll be resolved in the course of the next year or so, but there is high emotion around that right now in Olympia, and we did a meeting around this in Olympia that I'm going to say is close to 2,000 people, and a lot of us were escorted to our cars afterwards. Anyways, and I understand that, and hopefully at the end of the day we can do something that does right by the people that really legitimately need access, and quite frankly should have tax exemptions around marijuana, because that really shouldn't be the way we're generating revenues.
So probably have time for one last question.
I'll ask the retiree here.
Just have you had any inquiries from other states, from Oregon, from California, and so on? And what kinds of questions do you get from them about the problems and the potential?
Well, first of all, we do still coordinate regularly with Colorado. We have had a number of inquiries. The next two states that are in play probably are Alaska and Oregon, as anyone that follows this. On the recreational side, a lot more states on the medical side. We actually, our director and one of our board members is going back to D.C. to participate in a control states conference. This organization is really more about liquor, but actually they're kind of looking at this as being the next area that is probably going to be controlled by those types of states. And they've been asked to speak in the state of Maryland right next door. The questions are the ones that were being asked coming in. How do you control access? How do you address public safety? A lot of questions around revenue generation, but we don't know at this point. All we know is in the Colorado example, and even based on what we suspect, revenue looks like it's going to be more than people estimate. And at the bottom line, when we talk about if the legislature takes action, it's got a big McCleary problem around education. In my mind, there are only two things that adds solutions that are 6 figures or more, and that's probably internet taxation and marijuana. And so I think you're going to see some action there. But yeah, a lot of interest among states.
All right. Unfortunately, our time's up.